Good morning, everyone. So I just want to remind you we have a drawing after Katie's talk. So if you haven't had a chance to put your name into the basket, it will be on the back table so you can put that in later. And then also we have some surveys for the Hopland Wellness Center. And if you would be willing, we'd appreciate if you would fill one out as you are on your way out this morning. It just is a quick questionnaire of things that you think would be beneficial for yourself, your family, and the community. So pick one of these up as you go out, fill it out, and you can drop it into the donation box or just leave it on the table.
Alrighty. Good morning, everyone. Did everyone enjoy the breakfast? Yes. Like it's a terrible time to present after you eat. But it's actually probably good because I'll be moving around a bit. Let me grab one more thing. So our final presentation, it just flew by. So if you remember the first presentation, Conceal and Seal, we were looking at the invisible wounds of trauma. And I've appreciated that some of you have shared some of your own stories. And I wish I had more time to talk about those invisible wounds because it is very validating for those who struggle to be like, wow, like someone's finally acknowledging those wounds, or even for us maybe that don't have those wounds ourselves to build compassion for those who do. And so then we looked at the restriction of addiction, right? Looking at how addiction is a big barrier to healing. And then today, reveal and heal the journey of trauma recovery. So I'm going to briefly review in case any of you were not here. Why talk about trauma? Do you remember the answer to this? Because we don't talk about it. We need to talk about it. We looked at these different reasons why we don't talk about it. We think it's the minority when it's actually the majority. We often have an incorrect definition of trauma. And then going through the severity and the complexity of it, it's very confusing, both for the person and for those around them. And then there's an element of shame, in which silences the victim, silences those around, and so forth. And so if you put it all together, trauma is an unhealed, invisible wound that we have concealed and sealed. We think, right, we can bury it. And then addiction and avoidance restricts our ability to heal those invisible wounds. And so the final part of our trauma recovery is revealing and healing those. When you think about trauma recovery, that's used a lot. What are we talking about when we talk about recovery? So if you think about what it means to recover something, maybe a good analogy for this would be if you accidentally delete files from your computer. And you're like, oh, I need to recover those files. When I was in graduate school, I was working on my thesis, and theses are like books. And I was working at the computer at the library, and gone. 50 pages. I could not find it. I could not recover those files. Now, it ended up being a blessing, but when you think about recovery, right, it's the action or process of regaining possession or control of something stolen or lost. So when you think about trauma recovery, it's finding your true self, how God designed you, buried underneath pain and hurt. Sometimes we think, oh, I need to become someone new. No, it's there. Trauma recovery is just making sure that I think about someone who's buried, right? You're trying to uncover them, recover them. Trauma recovery is finding your true self. So step number one, the reveal part, is we need to have awareness. Do I need healing? You cannot change what you do not acknowledge, right? You cannot heal what you do not know is wounded. And that's why the first part, the whole conceal and seal, is to help realize, do I struggle with trauma? I love this quote. If you want to change the fruits, you will first have to change the roots. If you want to change the visible, you must first change the invisible. If you think about society today and how we are as humans in general, we're often just okay and satisfied with changing the visible, right? As long as I look good, right, smiling and, I dress well. We put a lot of time and effort into how we look on the outside. But that adds to the invisible wounds because I can smile. They often will say, how do you know someone's depressed or suicidal? They're smiling, AKA you don't know. We hide it really well, but if you really want lasting change, you have to look at the roots. You have to be willing, if you think about the difficult process of gardening, you have to be willing to get into the dirt and pluck the roots. When I was little, I thought I was, sneaky, and my mom would tell us, hey, go take out the weeds. And I'd go and, you want to save time because you want to go do other fun stuff. I found some scissors, and I went snip, 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 and it looked wonderful. Shortly after, my mom knew what happened. How did she know? They grew back very quickly. And many of us, when it comes to mental health healing, we want to do just that. Snip, 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 snip. Looks fine, but then it comes back. Whether that's addiction, whether that's medication, or other forms of therapy that we want quick. But roots and deep root work, like this picture here, it runs deep, which means we need to be willing to look deeply and to work in a difficult way to pull out those roots. So first off, reflection, do I need healing? Stop looking at others for a second and look at yourself. In this society today, it's kind of like a catchphrase. People are saying, oh, that person triggered me. That thing triggered me. Oh, and I don't like to be triggered, and so I'm going to pull away from that person. And it's all focused at other people. But I love this, thinking about it in a different way. We don't realize that our guns are already loaded with ammo. So yes, they may trigger you, but what in me is being triggered? There's something already there. Sometimes people say, oh, it's my spouse. He made me angry, or she made me angry. And I tell them, well, they don't make me angry, so is it really your spouse, or there's something in you? Kneel and ask God to reveal those invisible wounds. There's a beautiful psalm, Psalm 139, where he says, search my heart, O God. And he says, try me, see if there's any, look at my anxious thoughts. See if there's any wicked way in me, or we could say broken way in me. It's asking, saying, I can't even do it myself. Like, look at me. Search me, your insecurities, your struggles, your vulnerabilities, even the ugliest parts of yourself that other people don't know of, and even sometimes we don't want to look in the mirror for ourselves. So here's some ways to kind of start looking at myself. Do I have any struggles? So I'm going to do a general self-assessment. Don't say anything out loud, just do it in your head, and then I'll do one more specific to trauma. We can look at your daily functioning. What is, how's my life at school, work, church, home, relationships, my energy levels, sleep? Take a look at that. Just do a survey. If you're saying, oh, I'm struggling at school, I'm struggling with concentration. Now, just know that this doesn't mean that I have a struggle here and there, miscellaneous. It's more of an ongoing daily functioning. If you don't sleep well once, every 7 days, that's not what we're talking about here. It's a pattern. Take a look at just your daily functioning. And we're going to be using this triangle. It's a core component of many different therapies of our thoughts, our emotions, and our behaviors. And these are three main core components of our mental health. If you think about it, they're all linked, and that's why it's in a triangle. If I think something negatively, right, I'm the worst person, or I'm so stupid, how's that going to impact my emotions? Negatively, right? So you might feel down, depressed. And then how would that depression or sadness impact my behaviors? Negatively, right? I might not be motivated. And this is what's so crazy. If I think I'm dumb, I'm stupid, and I feel depressed, then I'm like, well, what's the point? And so I don't do anything. And then that confirms my belief. Oh, look, see, you failed because you didn't study, right? It's like it becomes a cycle. So we need to take a look at these things. So here are some more specific questions to reflect on. For my behaviors, how are my habits? What does my diet look like? My exercise, my self-care? Do I have any addictions? Media, porn, eating, so forth. What about my emotions? What's my general mood most days? Am I most days down? Am I most days anxious, angry, ashamed? Is my mood consistent or unstable? Meaning one day I feel this way, the next day I feel another. What about my thoughts? What's the trend of my thoughts? Are they primarily negative, irrational? So take a look at yourself in these particular ways. Now, specifically for trauma, you can ask these questions. Have I experienced trauma? And that's why part one was part one. Can I think or talk about my traumas without a strong urge to avoid? So notice some people can talk about it, and I have clients sometimes in the first couple of sessions, they're like, yep, this is my trauma, and they say it under like 2 minutes. Their whole life story, they're trying to speed through it. They're trying to avoid the emotions that go along with it. They're like, oh, I can talk about it, no problem. Or sometimes I'll have them write it out, and then they'll read it super quickly. Can you talk about it without a strong urge to avoid? How do I feel when I talk about it? Now, trauma, and I'll mention this a little bit later, always will include grief. So this is not to say that you can talk about it with a smile, you can talk about it without any tears, but how strong are those emotions? Am I triggered frequently? That's a sign that there may be unhealed traumas. Are these triggers perhaps related to my traumas? It's so fascinating when I do this work with clients. They're like, oh, I was triggered. And I'm like, okay, let's connect it back to the trauma. They sit there and they try to think, and then it's like a light bulb. There's a book called What Happened to You. It's one of the ones I'm going to recommend later. And it's written by Dr. Bruce Perry, who's a child psychiatrist. He specifies in trauma. And he says this in the book. It's a case example where this boy, teenage boy, had a lot of trauma in his childhood, but he was working with this psychiatrist, and he was going back to school, doing fine, but this one particular class he was really struggling in and having behavioral problems. And the teacher and other people were like, oh, what's going on with him? And so the child psychiatrist started to watch him and try to collect data, what's going on? And they found that, okay, it's not the subject matter, it's not the other children, what's going on? And the child himself didn't even know. This teenager had no idea. And what it ended up being was that the teacher wore the same deodorant smell as his father, who was abusive. And the child had no idea that he was being triggered because the brain, again, trauma is stored in our brain as fragments, was being triggered by the same scent. So part of the healing process is reflecting and saying, I need to reveal those invisible wounds. It's there. He had no idea. But if we spend enough time on those triggers, we can reveal and understand, oh, it's not the teacher, it's the smell. And so the child worked with the psychiatrist in order to overcome that trigger. So what exactly is the problem when it comes to trauma? Many times we think, oh, my addictions, anxiety, depression. Remember, those are the symptoms, not the root. But then we say, okay, well, it's the trauma itself. What happened to me is the trauma or the problem. And that's a yes and no. Yes, the trauma is traumatic, but I referenced this earlier about 9/11. If it was only the trauma, then what we would expect is that everyone exposed to the same trauma would have the same response, right? If it was just the event itself. But with 9/11, after 9/11, they did a study to see how many people had PTSD after 9/11. And they found only an average of 5% after 7 to 12 months had PTSD. Like 5%, that's not even the majority. So what about these people developed, right, PTSD? It's not just the event. What is it? So we looked at this yesterday briefly, and these are the three main components of PTSD, and we saw that avoidance gets in the way of recovery. So going back to the 9/11 example, what we understand is everyone, notice the measurement was 7 to 12 months after, everyone in those first couple months could have had these symptoms, but those who continued on to struggle were those who did not heal. Whether we talked about like the example of a physical wound or an emotional wound, is we have the ability to heal, but what gets in the way? And so we see that that's avoidance. And so if we know that avoidance gets in the way, and specifically in the way of processing the trauma. So if you think about trauma being fragments, and think about not just fragments, but sensory fragments, like the deodorant, right? Our brain, with something so traumatic, captures the sense, the sights, the sounds, all these things, and they're fragments. But if in the first month we say, oh, what happened? And we talk about it with community or other people, we start putting all those fragments into one picture, to one cohesive memory, which goes back to why in this picture, what's primarily left is the memory. That's a natural healing process. But if I don't process, if I don't put those fragments together, what I end up having is a lot of that arousal still, a lot of triggering that goes with that arousal, a lot of intrusions, because your brain is trying to say, hey, let's process it. And this is what happens a lot with nightmares, because our brain, when we sleep, is trying to consolidate memory, is trying to put things together. Do you know that when you go to sleep, it takes the whole inventory of the day and it tries to process it? This is why PTSD is so problematic, because something gets in the way so that we don't recover. But then we see that people, even at night, where sleep would help them process, they're having nightmares and poor sleep that then further doesn't allow them to heal. The double whammy, right? So this is also why sleep is so important, to be able to overall integrate it into our memory storage as a complete memory, which then leads to healing. So if avoidance gets in the way of processing, we need to remove the avoidance. This is the part people don't like. We need to approach the trauma. We need to address it. And that's hard, right? Because in general, we like to avoid pain. We like to avoid discomfort, whether it's the discomfort of a headache or the discomfort these days. If you think about society has a lot of comforts. We don't even like the discomfort of heat anymore. We want to put up the AC. We want to make sure that our houses are perfect. All these things. Back in the day, we had a lot of resilience. People washing their clothes by hand. Right? Now, I'm grateful for a washer and a dryer. But if you really think about it, we lack resilience these days. We have too many comforts. Even back in the day, you'd have to get up and change the channel on the TV. But now people don't even want to use remotes. They just want to say, hey, change the channel, right, into their remote. It's crazy how little we want to work. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I think it's agenda. We're really struggling with discomfort, with any sort of effort. And trauma work requires a lot of effort. So step number 2, so number 1, reveal, being intentional about understanding ourselves. And then what about healing? This is a big umbrella step with a lot of little steps. And depending on our time, I often include a lot more information in my slides than what I get through as a way for people to study on their own afterwards. So notice this verse, which I quoted earlier, search my heart, O God, know my heart, try me, know my anxieties. That's the reveal part. But only until you do that, notice, lead me in the way everlasting. We could say, lead me in the path of healing. There's recognized 3 stages of recovery when it comes to trauma: safety, remembrance and mourning, and reconnection. So I'm going to use those as categories to go through. So the first stage of safety, if you think about, a lot of times we want to sometimes jump into the trauma and say, okay, I'm ready to heal. But if you don't have a good foundation, you're going to really struggle. You don't want to add more pain before, do I have the ability to cope? A good example of this is if my client is suicidal, we're not going to jump into the trauma and add more discomfort and pain until that person feels more safe and stable. Or let's say if someone is having a severe addiction and engaging in self-harm or other things, we want to make sure that they're more stable before addressing the trauma. And so if you think about it from the thoughts, emotions, behaviors standpoint, we want to, for example, with behaviors, start to decrease unhealthy behaviors and increase healthy behaviors, including, I would say, one of the most important things is trying to have better sleep. Again, if you know that sleep improves your frontal lobe, helps with processing and so forth, if you don't address that, the trauma work is going to be harder. Now, not impossible, but harder. So what can I do in my behavioral work to improve my ability to then, when I do work on my trauma, to consolidate that? That includes also diet, exercise, not to say these have to be perfect, but trying to aim towards a healthier brain that can then process the trauma. Emotions. I wish I had more time to talk about this, because remember that trauma disrupts us from ourselves. We end up hating our bodies, and I don't mean just someone who is physically harmed, but with big emotions, often we numb because we hate that our bodies are feeling these strong emotions. But we need to learn how to soothe our nervous systems. That is a key component to healing trauma, is how can I soothe myself? This includes childhood trauma, where parents didn't soothe their child, and so the child doesn't know how to soothe themselves. When a child falls down, scrapes their knee and starts to cry, what do they typically do? Go to their parents. Let's use mom as the primary example here. Child runs to mom, and what does mom do that's soothing for the child? I'm hearing hugs them, okay. We soothe through our senses. So what sense is the hugging? Touch. There might be an element of pressures. A parent also might caress the child. Touch. We're soothed through touch. What else? Soft words. What sense is that? Hearing. Just hearing. There were times even in my adult life, my mom would just say something in her voice and I just like break down crying, right? Because of the soothing nature of my mother's voice. What else? Saying it's okay. Yeah, that's also part of this. What was that? Yes. Now, it can be soothing, but sometimes we have to be careful that we invalidate someone. It's okay. Oh, you shouldn't be sad. And it's like, no, you should be, right? What other senses? So we went through sound, touch. What about smell? Smelling mom. My mom wore Chanel No. 5. And it was soothing for me because that was my mom's scent. What about, what are we missing with our senses? Sight, just the sight of our mothers. And then taste. This is now often with milk or other things. And this is why a lot of people turn to alcohol as the adult bottle. But we're soothed through our senses. This is why nature is so healing. Because nature has all the senses built into it. It's God's way of soothing his children. And so can I learn to regulate my nervous system? Can I learn through things like the nature, deep breathing, right? Other skills, but also just being more mindful of my emotions. What am I feeling and why am I feeling it, right? Validating ourselves in those experiences. And then thoughts, which is going to be a key component, which we'll address a little bit later, of changing negative thought patterns. So emotions, this is good for you to know, emotions only last 90 seconds in our bodies. Do you know that? What emotions really are chemicals, right? Different cocktails of different hormones that pump through our body. It only lasts 90 seconds. Now, you could think through your emotions, you're like, Katie, mine lasts longer than 90 seconds. Well, what happens is we get this burst of different hormones, different cocktails of hormones, but then our thoughts renew 90 more seconds. So if you notice for a child, if they feel something and they start crying and they're soothed, gone. But if we are feeling a certain way and then we start thinking, yes, oh, my life is terrible, there goes 90 more seconds. Oh, I'll never get through this, 90 more seconds. Our thoughts are the trigger behind our emotions. Our body then releases those hormones. So we need to learn how to capture our thoughts. So stage number 2, so that was stage number 1 of trying to seek more safety and stability and learning how to cope better for your brain and for your whole system in order to then, when we engage in stage 2, we're at a better place to remember the trauma and to mourn the trauma. Trauma is very similar, although sometimes I think we put it in 2 different categories. It's really the same as grief. We are always grieving something when it comes to trauma, whether we're grieving the loss of something in ourselves that was stolen from me, right? My innocence was stolen from me. We're grieving something that we have lost. Or maybe we're grieving something that we lost in a relationship. Sometimes it's even grieving expectations, right? Reality is not as I expected it to be. So grief is a huge part, the mourning process of trauma. So we process, we express, and then we also make sure that our narrative of the trauma is correct. There's a specific therapy called cognitive processing therapy. Anyone here heard of CPT? A couple people. Great, actually more than I expected. So it came out as CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, which is one of the most evidence-based practices there are for across the board, but it lacked a specific focus on trauma. And so CPT was developed, and it looks at still these 3 main components of thoughts, emotions, and behaviors, but it focuses a lot on thoughts, cognitive processing. These are the 3 main things that it addresses, and I'm going to do a really fast version of just going through some of these, but I'm going to slow down in the trauma section, trauma count, and ABC sheets. So the first thing that we have people do when they come in is to write out why they think, actually let me go to the next, a 1-page document of why did the trauma happen. We're not asking them to write their trauma, we're asking them to write why it happened. And the reason behind that, and then also how did the trauma impact them in these 5 different areas, which are 5 main areas of life. How did it impact my sense of intimacy, trust, power, control, esteem, and safety, is we're trying to see if we have any incorrect narratives about the trauma. If you say, oh, it happened to me, do you remember Linda? Her main narrative was, it was my fault. So if she continues to believe it was her fault for the rest of her life, she's the perpetrator. She's walking around in danger because it was her fault. And so we would need to correct that. So why did it happen? Oh, it was my fault. Or sometimes you say, oh, well, if I only loved this person enough, they wouldn't have done that to me. In domestic violence situations of, oh, if I only, and sometimes remember, others silence the victim and blame the victim as well. And someone had shared with me, it's like, it's not just victim blaming, but also defending the perpetrator. That continues the cycle of abuse. So oftentimes in domestic violence, if someone comes in and says, oh, it happened because I didn't clean the dishes enough and he was really upset with me. I wasn't a good enough wife. Oh, not only to not have future trauma, but also to heal the past one, we need to identify what we call stuck points. Thoughts about the trauma that keep us stuck in recovery. But also when we talk about how did it impact me in these different areas, we're trying to see if there were also stuck points in these areas. So if we say, oh, with trust, I can't trust anyone ever again. That's going to continue to impact them. Remember, it's not just about the event, it's the narrative that we have formed as a result of that. Some people could have gone through trauma and said, yep, that person hurt me. That person's dangerous, and I'm going to stay away from that person. They're going to heal from the trauma. They processed it correctly. They'll heal, and they'll move on. But if they're like, oh, that person hurt me, and that person's a male, and all men are untrustworthy, now, will that protect them from future abuse? Partially, yes. They're going to stay away from all men. But what will it also do? Isolate them and lack connection. But not only that, but yes, maybe partially protect them. But can someone hurt them that's not a male? Yeah. We did this after 9/11. Oh, all Muslims are terrorists. Now, was there some truth in that? Yeah, some Muslims were terrorists, and we're trying to protect ourselves, but we then started being racist towards certain people, causing more harm. And could a white person be a terrorist? Yeah, so it doesn't really protect, but often because trauma happens and rattles our brain and then we didn't process it, we start creating these narratives thinking that we're protecting ourselves when we're not. And so therapy is trying to dig and find those stuck points that are keeping us from recovery. This is from the manual. By the time, and this is emphasizing also childhood trauma, by the time child and adolescent trauma victims receive therapy as adults, they may have settled on cognitions or thoughts that were constructed at a time when their executive functions, their frontal lobes, were not fully developed. This is probably the reason why so many clients with PTSD have extreme beliefs and have been traumatized repeatedly. CPT may well assist such clients in developing affect regulation, regulating their emotions, increasing their thought flexibility instead of being so rigid, and changing many assumptions and beliefs that were developed at a period of cognitive immaturity, and key point here, that were never re-examined because of avoidance symptoms. So if I create this belief, all men are untrustworthy, but I never re-examine them, I'm going to continue living based off of that reality. Or let's say for children, where it's highlighting here, their frontal lobe, which helps them with logic and reasoning, isn't fully developed to recognize that these beliefs of I'm not good enough, I'm worthless, or other things, where their parents or other people had told them for years, are not true. We need to re-examine those beliefs. So if you think about the way kids learn, it's very rigid and limited. So they're learning in their language development, and they're outside. Let's say you're the parent or you're an aunt or uncle, and the child's like, oh, what's that? And they point to a bird in the sky, and you say, oh, that's a bird. So the child's like, okay, bird. And then they look at an airplane, and they're like, bird. What do? Do you say, oh yeah, that's a bird? You then add more information for them to start extending their truth. And then they say, oh, something else that flies in the sky can be an airplane. And then maybe a helicopter, and then Superman, right? All these other things where the child starts building their reality. But when trauma happens, a child is told, you're stupid. And actually what's interesting is if you look at the data, what's most harmful in childhood is actually not physical or sexual abuse, it's emotional abuse. Because the wounds of emotional abuse actually last longer. I'm stupid, I'm stupid, I'm stupid, I'm stupid. Throughout their entire lives, they continue on because they've never re-examined that. If the child learns that everything in the sky is a bird, they will literally, for the rest of their lives, believe that. And sometimes I tell my clients, hey, if I told you that the sky was green and the ground was blue, you would, for the rest of your life, believe that. That's how children's development works. Well, the same applies to these realities of trauma that we have to re-examine. So stuck points are thoughts that you have about or that come from the trauma that keeps you stuck in the trauma and prevents recovery. So here are some examples that I've pulled from some of my clients that are very common in trauma. Self-blame is one of the most common ones. I'm to blame for the abuse. I am damaged forever because of the blank, whether rape or something else. I'm damaged forever. I must be on guard at all times. So trauma happens, and then your brain goes to this extreme belief, to protect myself, I need to be on guard at all times. Other people should not be trusted, right? This all or nothing thinking of trustworthiness gone. God is punishing me. If I let other people get close to me, I'll get hurt again. I must control everything that happens to me. Expressing any emotion means I will lose control of myself. The world is dangerous. Notice as I say some of these things, there's bits of truth. This is what makes these so difficult. There may be bits of truth, including the world is dangerous, but is the whole world dangerous all the time? And then another very common one that I see is I am powerless. Where if you think about those last two, if you pair those two together, the world is dangerous and I am powerless, that contributes to significant anxiety. So here you are trying to treat the anxiety, but what's underneath it might be, if I'm completely helpless and powerless, do I want to leave the house? Because the world is dangerous and I'm powerless. I can't protect myself. So that's agoraphobia. Some people say, I'm powerless to my emotions. That often contributes to panic attacks. I can't have any ability to control my own body. And so we see that these stuck points are what are feeding a lot of our different symptoms. So we first find the stuck points, and we'll come back to them in a moment to challenge them. But the next step that we work on is having people, not everyone has to do this, but write their trauma account. And so the trauma account is to help them with their processing. So this is where we write the details of the event, including the sensory details. Remember, if it's stored as fragments, we want to put them together into one narrative. The second count includes writing their thoughts and feelings about the incident, and then you read it daily. Any ideas of why reading it daily? Yes? But a big part of it is building confidence that I can handle that memory. One thing that people don't realize, they're afraid of I actually thought this in the very beginning when I was being trained in this, I'm having them relive the trauma. That's scary. Are they reliving the trauma? No. We have to realize it's just a memory. We have to tell our bodies, because our body's reacting as if it's happening again. And we need to tell our bodies, it's a memory, it's done. You have already, if you think about it, people who've gone through trauma are extremely strong and resilient. They've already gone through the trauma. So to think about it is not reliving it. It's actually saying, I have the confidence enough to be able to put it away in the storage of my memory. So reading it daily is a practice of desensitization. And I've had clients who are struggling to write it the first time and struggling to read it in session and struggling to read it to themselves. And then by the end of therapy, they're I'm a little bored. I've already read it so often, it becomes just simply a memory. Think about all the memories that you have, pleasant, unpleasant. They're all memories. And so we have to build a sense of confidence. But when we avoid the memory, what we're actually doing is saying that it's still dangerous. This is what happens with OCD. If you're if I touch this, I'm going to contract a virus and die. And so OCD is I'm going to avoid it. But will I actually contract a virus and die if I touch this? No. So if I continue to avoid it, by my actions, I'm confirming my irrational belief. So OCD treatment will say, touch it. It won't even say touch it, it'll say touch it and then lick it. They've done this with clients who don't like public restrooms. You're lick the toilet seat. You're oh, that's gross, but why go to that extreme? To realize that you'll never be licking the toilet seat, but if you do that, even that won't kill you. You need to build confidence to realize God has built us to be extremely resilient. I can see a lot of people feeling disgusted right now. Now, no one go, that was not my recommendation to go lick toilet seats. But it's this idea that I can handle difficult things and I will be okay, especially because trauma has already happened. And I just need my brain to be able to process it enough to put it away in the file cabinet of your memory. A beautiful story in the Bible is the story of a hemorrhaging woman. She was bleeding for 12 years nonstop. And when you read her story, the details of her story, you realize she experienced a lot of trauma. Financial trauma, medical trauma. This is something I haven't mentioned before. You can experience trauma from medical professionals. And it says that she went to medical professionals and no one helped her, drained her of her finances. We can read kind of in between the lines that back then culturally, if a woman was bleeding, she was ostracized from the community. Typically, you're on your menstrual cycle, you'd be away for a certain amount of time. But she was constantly bleeding, so she would have been completely cut off from society, from her husband. She would have been labeled as unclean. She would have experienced extreme shame. And so for her to come out in public was already a huge, huge effort on her part. But she wanted, which goes back to yesterday, and then it's also a point today, how bad do you want healing? She was willing to risk the shame of coming into the public, and she goes and she reaches out to Jesus' mantle. And if you know the story, she touches him, and what happens? Does it say that she's healed? What does it say? Does anyone know? Her bleeding stopped immediately. But it doesn't say she's healed. Then what happens next in the story is Jesus stops her. And you wonder why. Why didn't just Jesus allow her to go on her merry way? Why did Jesus stop her? He stops her. There's something that goes on. And then he says, your faith has made you whole. Then he pronounces healing. Go. So she was only healed after the interaction with Jesus. Why? And Luke shares a little detail that it says that Jesus asked her in the presence of all to share her story. Why? Because yes, she was healed physically with her blood when she touched him, but she wasn't yet healed socially, reconnected with her community, that Jesus needed her to share her story publicly, and then for people to know she had been healed, to restore her back, to heal her shame, to heal her emotions. That's why he says, your faith has made you whole. God is not just looking for physical healing or temporary or a part of your healing. This is a story about the importance of sharing your story in order to overcome shame. And I love this quote. It says, shame dies when stories are told in safe places. That's what happened for the hemorrhaging woman. Jesus didn't want her to just walk away with partial healing. What a big part of her trauma was the social disconnection. And he made sure that she didn't walk away. Even though he was rushed to heal someone else, he took the time to say, you are worthy enough for my time and for all the people here to hear your story. And I'm sure, too, her sharing her story was very powerful for her. This is why people share testimonies. Why people, when they have healed, or even maybe not completely healed, start to share because it's healing for us. But notice it says safe places. Some people start, I need to share, and they start sharing in general. We need to share it in safe places. So the last piece of ABC sheets here is changing the meaning or narrative, addressing those stuck points. And if we realize, it's really interesting, there's different forms of trauma treatment, and often they'll address emotions or other components, but what I appreciate about CPT is it addresses the thoughts, because as Dr. Vanderkolk says, the greatest sources of our suffering are the lies we tell ourselves. The greatest sources of our suffering are the lies we tell ourselves. If you think about it, this gives us a lot of empowerment, because if it's lies we're telling ourselves, like, I have the ability to correct those lies. Now, the Bible adds that in John 8:44 that Satan is the father of all lies, because he comes and whispers to us these lies about our traumas and about ourselves, others, and about God. So This is an ABC sheet where we have people write down what happened, what are the thoughts that I have, and then how does that impact me, how does that make me feel? And then we start looking at those thoughts in column B, and we say, are those thoughts realistic and or helpful? Because a thought could be realistic, but it's not helpful to dwell on. And so we start re-examining those thoughts. So for my client who was saying, I'm to blame for the abuse, let's really look at that. Is that true? Now, I've worked with veterans who have done terrible things, and it was true that they were to blame. But it was really helpful to look at in a way, okay, well, what are you going to do with that? And they had to go through the process of forgiving themselves, right? Asking God for forgiveness. But we can't just stay with a thought. We need to either re-examine and rewrite it or take action. And then the last question, it says, what can I tell myself on such occasions in the future? This is neuroplasticity. I need to find the truth of my thoughts and then tell myself the truth over and over and over again until it becomes my reality. The first time we did this sheet, Linda did not believe she wasn't to blame because she had had that narrative for years. So it doesn't necessarily feel true immediately. And it doesn't feel true because our brain believes things that we tell with high intensity. If I'm like, I'm beautiful, my brain's not going to believe it. It's not like, I'm beautiful. Like high intensity and frequency. If I tell myself over and over and over again, I am to blame, I'm going to believe that. It's a well-formed pattern in my brain. Then we develop the sheet further, and it becomes very extensive, and you can look at this on your own time. But what it's doing is it's putting your thoughts on trial and giving it a fair trial, because you've always been like, oh, guilty, 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 but you've never looked at those thoughts. If you said, oh, no one can be trusted, you need to look at that, and then what ends up happening is we end up with a result of, some people can be trusted, sometimes with some things. And the trauma brain is so scared of being hurt again, it just doesn't want to trust anyone. And then we come along and we just say, yeah, no, you need to trust people. It's like, no, your brain needs to know, well, who do I trust? And with what? And have more discernment. And that way you do protect yourself while also still connecting with people. Notice, instead of black and white thinking or all or nothing, we need to find the gray. The truth is often in the middle. So here's some examples to work through. I just gave a few. Let's say I'm powerless. There's something in your trauma that you experienced that made you feel powerless. Children, this thought for children is actually true. You're completely powerless. In any sort of vulnerable relationship, spouse relation, you have a degree of powerlessness. But if we continue to believe that I'm completely powerless, I'm not going to take the actions needed to change my life. So this thought we need to put on trial and be like, okay, well, what's true about it? What are some examples of adults being powerless? What might we be powerless to at times? Change at work, okay? Now, that is a mixed one, because what people don't realize, they're like, oh, I've tried to talk to my boss, or I can't do anything. Well, you could still leave your job. So there's an element of powerlessness, but adults don't realize, some people stay in that job forever, being so unhappy, and it's like, we actually have a lot of power as adults. Or one of the things that we're definitely powerless over, like we can't control, is people. Now, we can influence people, but we can't control. And this is what I see a lot of times with trauma is we're trying to control the things we can't, which drains our energies. And then we don't control the things that we can, which then doesn't lead to further change. And so we have to re-examine, do I have these stuck points? And as I challenge them, the principle is found here in John 8:32. You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. The truth about my abuse, the truth of what happened. And the truth is not always positive. This is something I want to really emphasize. When we're changing our thoughts, we are not looking for positive thoughts. This is why a lot of people who try to do their own therapy, they get stuck because they're trying to aim for positive thoughts. And sadly, too, sometimes within a Christian environment, they think that's what the Bible teaches. Sometimes they quote Philippians 4:8 and be like, oh, whatever things are praiseworthy. Well, does anyone know what the list starts with in Philippians 4:8? True. Whatsoever things are true. That's our guiding principle, not positive. If you actually read the Bible, there are a lot of things that are not positive. It talks about a lot of trauma because life isn't always positive. People are not always trustworthy. You're not always safe. But it's also not to the other extreme of always negative. So we need to find the truth about ourselves, the truth about others, and so forth. Then there's two other main components that I want to emphasize, and they're touching on, notice, elements of trust, elements of power. For healing, we need to have a sense of empowerment and we need connection. Why is empowerment so important? I just alluded to it. Trauma often rips us of a sense of power. Things are done to us in which we're completely vulnerable to, and whether we're a child or a vulnerable adult, the power is one that the enemy is trying to really attack for us. So we have a sense of loss of power, and so we need to regain a sense of empowerment for healing. I mentioned Dr. Bruce Perry, the child psychiatrist, earlier. I don't recommend this book as one to read unless you're a clinician or a professional, not for someone's own healing journey, because it's a child psychiatrist, basically, notebook. Every chapter is a trauma. So if you're in a place of healing and you want to read, it's fascinating and wonderful, especially if you're a professional in this area. But if you're going through your own healing, it's often not helpful to hear about all the traumas of other people. But the book is entitled The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog, because it talks about, in one of the chapters, a boy who was raised as a dog and the trauma that he endured. But he highlights a lot of elements of healing, and here's the element of empowerment. After all, one of the defining elements of a traumatic experience, particularly one that is so traumatic that one dissociates because there's no other way to escape from it, is a complete loss of control and a sense of utter powerlessness. So if that's at the core of trauma, then as a result, he's saying, regaining control is an important aspect of coping with traumatic stress. And what's even interesting is he talks about this, is children, if they've experienced trauma and specifically powerlessness, is sometimes they will reenact the trauma in different ways to regain their power. This is what we see with bullying. A lot of times kids who are bullying at school is because they're being bullied at home. So they have no power in their home, so they want to bully at school to regain power. Adults do this too. They bully in the workforce, they bully in other areas, or sometimes you see this with spouses where in their work, they feel completely powerless, and so they come home and they want to overexert their power in the home setting. You even see this in churches, where someone is experiencing powerlessness in one area of their life, and so they want to have the power in church settings. This is where a lot of people abuse power in positions of leadership, because they're actually lacking it in other areas of their life, presently or in the past through trauma. So those are unhealthy ways of empowerment, is we want to be able to recognize, how do I channel that into healthier ways? Because it is natural for us as human beings to have a sense of power. That's how God designed us. If you think about Genesis chapter 1, God gave us dominion. It's a part of our nature. We need that for healing. There's a great study, well, a couple of studies that were done on empowerment. And one was a rat hanging from their tail, And what they termed from this experiment was learned helplessness. So they would hang the rat, and at first the rat would scramble trying to escape. But what it would eventually learn is nothing I do will help me escape. So what did it end up doing? It just started being still. There's no point in struggling, which if you think about is very adaptive. Yeah, why struggle if it's not going to turn out in any helpful way for me? They also did this with dogs, where they would put a dog in a box and they would have the dog, some dogs, on a shock pad. And they would shock the dog over and over again. And some dogs had the ability to, and this is before the whole, animal protections. Some of these are older studies. But some dogs, one group, had the ability to press a lever and the shocks would stop. So what did those dogs learn? That they have control to stop their pain. But another group of dogs were just on the shock pad, they had no lever, and they just get shocked over and over and over again. So what did they learn? Helplessness. Then they took those dogs and they put them in this box where, if you could see, on the left side is the shock pad, and all they needed to do is jump across in order to not be shocked. So the one who learned that they have control, they would immediately jump. What do you think happened to the dogs who had no lever in the first condition? They just stayed on the shock pad. They could have jumped over and stopped the shocks, but they had learned there's no point in doing anything to stop my pain, even though they were in a new environment. I remember when I learned this study, and it just immediately gave me compassion for my clients. Because often I'll be like, okay, do this homework, or make this change, and set these boundaries. And they would do nothing. And I'm like, come on, you can do it. And I'd get frustrated, and I realized they're these dogs. They don't believe that they can change. Because oftentimes, especially in childhood, if you have trauma happen to you over and over and over again, you start to believe that all these things happen to you and you have no power to make your life any different. And so they needed to teach them that they'd had, what's crazy too is they would pick up the dog and put them in, the non-shock, and still the dog it was so ingrained, it took them multiple times of doing this until the dog learned, oh, I have power. But it's interesting, we can think about sometimes we're the people that need to pick up the dog and show them a different life. This study is really fascinating, where they took rats and they put them in a pool of water, and they wanted to see how long they'd swim before they would sink and drown. And on average, they'd give up after 15 minutes, and then they would sink and drown. Now, what they started to do is they said, okay, they give up about 15 minutes, but what if before they give up, we pluck them out of the water, give them a sense of empowerment and hope, and then put them back? How much longer do you think they were able to go when they started realizing, well, maybe if I keep going, the experimenter will pluck me out and save me and then put me back in? So remember, they were only able to last 15 minutes. How much longer do you think they were able to go? 1 minute. 1 minute longer? Okay. Any other ideas? Okay, 30 minutes to an hour. Any others? 60 hours. 60 hours. That's 2.5 days. So they went from only being able to do 15 minutes, this shows the power of the mind, to then 60 hours. Why? Because they had the hope that if I just keep going, maybe they'll pluck me out. And I enjoy running, and I do a lot of long distance running, not so much these days, but this is the idea behind when you feel like you're at your max, you've only done 20%. You still have 80% left. Or they'll say, oh, if you're about to give up and running, just say, oh, 5 more minutes, or just around the corner. Because we're more capable than what we realize. So these kinds of studies help us understand, oh, empowerment, hope is very encouraging and helps us to do very difficult things. Another way to think about this is having trauma is often a victim mentality versus having a victor mentality. Where yes, you were the victim. Now, sometimes people say, oh, I can't have victim mentality. And then we shame the victims. It's like, no, you really were a victim. But victim mentality is staying in that victimization instead of realizing I have choice. What do I do with the trauma that I've experienced? I love this quote. It says, when we're no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. Viktor Frankl, I don't know how many of you have read his book or books. His most popular one's Man's Search for Meaning. And he was a psychiatrist who survived the concentration camps. And if you haven't read it, I highly encourage to read the book, Man's Search for Meaning. And he talks about the power of choosing your own way. There's a section that I've memorized because not word for word, but just the concept, where he's describing, he's in the camp and he's looking at everyone. And if you think about the details of their experience, they're ripped of complete power. They're taking away their identity, their family, they're just a number. They shave their heads, right? They barely have any food. And he says, you look at them, the typical inmate, and you would expect them, right, to just be survival of the fittest. But he said, and many of them were, but there were a few that even in those circumstances would still give away their last piece of bread. Right? You'd think, oh, I'm starving, like I'm not going to give that to someone else. And he's like, although there were not many, he said there were few, it taught me that everything could be taken from a man but one thing. You know what that one thing is? Choice. Power to choose your own way. Because he said either most inmates there were the plaything of circumstance, where we're just like, okay, well, circumstance dictates this. And he's like, no, those men showed me that everything could be stripped from someone except your choice of how do I choose to respond to my trauma. And if you think about their experience, we wouldn't condemn them for not giving away their last piece of bread. Right? We wouldn't condemn them for acting in malicious ways. And yet, it shows us that we can have choice. And we see that God emphasizes that, even in the story of the man at the pool of Bethesda, where he says, do you want to be made whole? We have to be a participant in the healing process. We need to be empowered in that experience. And part of that is to make meaning. So the first step, a big part of trauma recovery is changing the narrative. And as you do that, you go from really negative thinking to more truthful thinking. But then we have what we call post-traumatic growth, in which people graduate to another level. They don't just are okay or are able to cope with their trauma. They actually find meaning in the midst of their trauma. This is one of the quotes in the book, but from Nietzsche. To live is to suffer. To survive, or to thrive, I would say, is to find some meaning in the suffering. But just know that if you're in the first stages of healing, this is too hard to do. We're not expecting you to find meaning immediately in your suffering. You first need to heal from that, and then you are able to find meaning. And that's what we do in the final step of CPT, is we have them rewrite their narrative. And what we see is they go from I'm to blame to this happened. And it's a part of living in a sinful world, and I accept and so forth. But then they're able to rewrite it in a way that brings them meaning, including for Linda, she ended up being a teacher and doing other things in her life of, I want to protect other children who have been victims of abuse. And what's fascinating is I tell this to my trauma clients, there are things that they can do with their trauma that I can't even do as a psychologist. I can't help people in the same way that they can. And the Bible has a verse that says, we comfort those with the comfort that we have received. And that's something that we can take what the enemy meant for bad, as Joseph says in his story, what you meant for evil, God God didn't cause it, because that's sometimes the positive thinking of like, oh, well, God wanted me to go through this. I'm like, God does not, he's not a proponent of trauma, but he can use it. And that's the term post-traumatic growth. It refers to positive changes that we experience after the trauma in which we would have never experienced without the trauma. You can grow in more ways because of the trauma than if you didn't experience it. The transformation, it's the process of transformation in which individuals emerge from a crisis with a deeper understanding of themselves, their relationships, their world, resulting in enhanced resilience, well-being, and personal growth. And this is where I see for some of my clients as well, like they'll often say, you know, because that happened, I'm much more of an empathic person. Even the trauma of mental illness. I had one client who just was super successful, top of her career, and then had a mental breakdown and was suicidal. And she's just like, what's happening to me? And she said, you know, I used to really stigmatize and put down people with mental illness. She said, because of this crisis, I have had much more empathy and understanding for people than I would have never been able to have, even by reading books or being exposed to other people with mental illness. And this is the reality of a butterfly. If you think about what, and you can study the details of what they go through with metamorphosis, but they have to go through a trauma in order to come out as a butterfly. The caterpillar completely breaks down, and not only does it completely break down, but when it is about to emerge from the cocoon, do you know what the butterfly has to do? It has to scrape its wings, and actually it can cause some damage, not really damage, it's strengthening it in order to be able to fly. I don't know about you, but for me, many times I've asked God, I'm at the point where I'm like, oh, can you just cut the cocoon? Can you just let me fly? But what would happen if I came along and said, let me help this butterfly, and I cut the cocoon? What would happen? It wouldn't fly. And so we often want to pluck someone out of distress when we realize that that distress itself can lead to this growth. Here's a poem that was written looking at biblical stories that talk about this principle. I would have pulled Joseph out of that pit, out of that prison, out of that pain. And I would have cheated nations out of the one God would use to deliver them from famine. I would have pulled David out of Saul's spear-throwing presence, out of the caves he hid away in, out of the pain of rejection. And I would have cheated Israel out of a God-hearted king. I would have pulled Esther out of being snatched from her only family, out of being placed in a position she never asked for, out of the path of a vicious, power-hungry foe. And I would have cheated a people out of the woman God would use to save their very lives. I would have pulled Jesus off of the cross, off of the road that led to suffering and pain, off of the path that would mean nakedness and beatings, nails and thorns. And I would have cheated the entire world out of a Savior, out of salvation, out of an eternity filled with no more suffering and no more pain. And oh friend, I want to pull you out. I want to change your path. I want to stop your pain. But right now I know I would be wrong. I'd be out of line. I would be cheating you and cheating the world out of so much good. Because God knows, He knows the good this pain will produce. He knows the beauty this hard will grow. He's watching over you and keeping you even in the midst of this. And He's promising you that you can trust Him, even when it all feels more than you can bear. So instead of trying to pull you out, I'm lifting you up. I'm kneeling before the Father and I'm asking Him to give you strength, to give you hope. I'm asking Him to protect you and to move you when the time is right. I'm asking Him to help you stay prayerful and discerning. I'm asking Him how I can best love you and be of help to you. And I'm believing He's going to use your life in powerful and beautiful ways, ways that will leave your heart grateful and humbly thankful for this road you've been on. Isn't it true that from a human perspective, we want to pull people out, we want ourselves to be pulled out of these extremely difficult and traumatic experiences? I sometimes with a client in session, I'm like, I just want to rescue them right now. I just want to pull them out. But what the Bible shows are stories of people who have endured in ways that if we did, including Jesus himself, we would have been cheating themselves and the world out of so much good. The cross was a symbol of torture, excruciating pain and death, right? It was a symbol. Like, we wear crosses around our necks these days. Why? Because he was able to rewrite the narrative of his own trauma. Christ died and it became a symbol of life, right? From torture to treasure. And that's the same experience he wants for you, to be able to be empowered to rewrite your narrative, that what the enemy meant for evil, God turned into good. And then the last main component, we mentioned empowerment, is connection. Connection is so important, as I mentioned, with addiction as well, because if the core of trauma is rupturing of relationships, then we must restore relationships. Here's a quote from Body Keeps the Score. Being able to feel safe with other people is probably the single most important aspect of mental health. Safe connections are fundamental to meaningful and satisfying lives. And that's why we see in the world today full of addictions, is because there's also a lack of connection. And here's another quote. This one's very powerful. The most traumatic aspects of all disasters involve the shattering of human connections. This is especially true for children. Being harmed by the people who are supposed to love you, being abandoned by them, being robbed of the one-on-one relationships that allow you to feel safe and valued and to become humane. These are profoundly destructive experiences because humans are inescapably social beings. The worst catastrophes that can befall us inevitably involve relational loss. As a result, recovery from trauma and neglect is all about relationships, rebuilding trust, regaining confidence, returning to a sense of security, and reconnecting to love. Of course, medications can relieve symptoms, and talking to a therapist can be incredibly useful, but healing and recovery are impossible, even with the best medications and therapy in the world, without lasting, caring relationships with others. And this is a psychiatrist speaking, right? We have to realize that a big part of healing includes relationships. And part of that, I don't have time to get into, so I'll give you some resources. Forgiveness is essential for healing, essential part of the mourning process. This is not referring to cheap forgiveness. This is not referring to forgiving someone without boundaries. That's a big misconception, that we often just talk about forgiveness and we act as if that we need to re-expose ourselves to more danger. Oh, I forgive and I forget. One, you can't forget. It's not possible. But two, we need boundaries. Matthew 18 has a long parable about forgiveness, but it's also the chapter that talks about if someone hurts you, you go talk to them, and if it doesn't get resolved, it says cut them off like a heathen. That's a boundary for you. Is as you're healing through trauma, we don't have time to get into this, you must utilize these two components in relationships. And most people struggle with boundaries. And so if you don't have a house with boundaries, right? We were talking about feeling unsafe on your home property. If you don't have fences, if you don't have wild animals, if you don't have fences around your garden's not protected. If you don't have fences around your home, if you don't have alarm systems, we need boundaries. But it's not just about connecting to others. We talked about this last night. Most importantly, it's also about connecting with God. And this is what I want to close with, is a story I've learned a lot about trauma was through the story of my father. So the grumpy looking kid there, the smallest is me. My dad there is in the middle. And my father grew up in Brazil, so he's Brazilian. And when he was a baby, his mother didn't want him and abandoned him to the footsteps of his aunt's house. So first trauma, right? Abandoned, not wanted, rejected by his very own mother. He's there for a couple years with his aunt, and his aunt has her own children, living in poverty, struggling. Basically, Cinderella's story treats him like a slave. And eventually, saying different things like, you're not my child, your mom never wanted you, just straight re-injuring of the trauma. But his aunt eventually says, I don't want you either, and sends him off to an orphanage. Rejection and abandonment, number 2. He's there in the orphanages, and this is a part of his story he hasn't shared, but I would imagine at that time in orphanages there were multiple traumas that probably happened. Kids often physically abusing one another, sexually abusing one another, so we can't even imagine the traumas that he must have faced in the orphanage system. And from orphanage to orphanage, more rejection, he ends up then on the streets of Brazil at age 16. All by himself, living on his own, age 16, in also, if you know about Brazil, the favelas and other extremely dangerous and violent environments. So you can imagine the extent of the trauma that my father faced. But at age 16, he met a pastor, and the pastor handed him a book. This book was the Bible. And he said, my dad was a little problematic and mischievous at that time. He's like, this will fix you. And so he reads the Bible. And one of the verses that stood out to him that was extremely healing was this verse. Can a mother forget the baby at her breast? Right? It's painting a picture of a breastfeeding mother. Imagine it for a moment. Would it be easy to forget a child on your breast? You would imagine it's saying, like, no, like the baby's right there. But the answer is yes. Mothers forget, aka abandon, reject their very own child and have no compassion on the child she is born. It's asking a question in which you would think the answer is like, of course not. But the answer is yes. Though she may forget, I will not forget you. See, I have engraved you on the palms of my hands. This is talking about Jesus on the cross, right, being nailed in a permanent way to say, I love you. I will never forget you. And my father read this, and he realized, I may not have an earthly family. I may not have a mother who loves me and one that forgets me, but I have a heavenly Father that loves me and died for me. And from that point on, my father's life changed. And it was so fascinating. I remember I was sitting in a graduate school course talking about attachment and trauma, and my teacher was painting a very grim outlook on trauma. And she said, basically, when you have this upbringing, this kind of upbringing with trauma and poor attachment, you're going to really struggle in life. And I went up to her and I shared the story about my father, and she's like, how? And I'm like, I have a great relationship with my father. I'm very close with him. He's not perfect, but I said, I have a wonderful attachment with my father. And she's like, how? I shared, well, he learned to attach to his heavenly Father. And this taught me that one of the most healing things for trauma is connecting with God. Timothy Keller says it this way: to be loved but not known is comforting but superficial. To be known and not loved is our greatest fear. But to be fully known and truly loved is, well, a lot like being loved by God. It is what we need more than anything. Isn't that true? If we were to really boil it down, what we really are seeking in life is to be fully known and fully loved. This is why marriage is so desired in life, because that's the closest that we can get to with a human, to be fully known and fully loved. And yet still we're afraid because people will hurt us, people will reject us, but to be fully known and fully loved, well, it's only fully possible with God. Now, with the true God of who we understand him to correctly be. And so a big part of trauma healing has to be reconnecting with this God of love. So to close, some applications, some things to think through. What evidence is there in my life that demonstrates I have invisible wounds? What stuck points, negative thoughts do I have about myself, others, or God that's keeping me from being healed? Do I have a victim or victor mentality in life? Who are the people in my life, who can help me? What is my relationship with God like? And then what is one step I commit to taking today, and thinking more so of this whole weekend, that I can commit to in healing from my traumas? Now, before I close, I mentioned that I will be providing all my slides, so these slides will be included. And I'm not going to go through this in depth, but I'll just show you what you can expect from accessing the slides. Is I have different books that I recommend. So this slide here are going to be books that I recommend for trauma specifically. Now, different people experience different traumas, so whenever I talk to an audience where I don't know the specific concerns, the first one is a general one, what happened to you. The second one is on childhood sexual abuse. It's one of the most helpful ones, that it's very specific to childhood sexual abuse. Then the last two have to do more with the connection between our minds and our bodies. This next one has to do with relationships. So the first two are on forgiveness, right? A big component of our healing journey. Then boundaries, and especially if you have struggled with attachment, you're going to want to learn how to have safe relationships. And that sounds like, wait, what, Katie? What are you talking about? Many of us don't know the signs of unsafe people, and so we re-injure ourselves by connecting with people that are unsafe. And then many times we don't know how to engage with safe people. So that's a guide for you as well. This next slide will give you resources on healing our relationship with God, especially in the context of trauma. Why do bad things happen? Why do I pray and I don't see God answering? And then there's a book called God in Pain, talking again about suffering. And then this last one's kind of a hodgepodge of attachment and addiction. So How We Love, it was one of the, well, we had several books here that were giveaways. Talking about attachment, I mentioned it before. Then there's one related to our attachment with God, and then one specifically on addiction, and one on digital addiction. So how to minimize and become more of a minimalist with your digital access. Then some audio resources. So where I work, I'm one of the podcast hosts of the Brain People podcast. It's a great podcast on all things mental health. It's a team of 4, so 2 psychiatry, one's a psychiatrist, one's a PA, talking, they have an angle a lot about medication and supplements. And then myself and my colleague Amanda Anguish, we talk a lot more about the therapy things, so all things mental health. And then my sister, she's a marriage and family therapist, and myself, we did a temporary series during COVID called Truth Prescriptions, and that looks at CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, and the Bible, how to integrate that. So that's on YouTube, called Truth Prescriptions. And then I do a lot of speaking, so you can find some of my other seminars on Audioverse. So you can look at that later. And then some of you have asked about Beautiful Minds, where I work, and what resources do they have there. There is psychotherapy as well as psychiatry services. There's an intensive outpatient program, which is a 3-week program. It's outpatient, meaning you're not living there. You come in every single day from 9 to 12. Intensive, meaning you're there every day, 5 days a week from 9 to 12. And specifically, you also work with a psychiatrist and a team that helps you overcome depression, anxiety, other issues. It's a fantastic holistic program, so they also emphasize diet and exercise. We also have a wellness center where you can incorporate hydrotherapy, massage therapy as a part of your treatment, which is very beneficial. For those people who can't come in person, we have a version of that intensive outpatient program online. I'm one of the instructors. It's called Overcoming Anxiety and Depression. And then on our website, we have tons of free webinars on different topics as well, other online resources. And then some of you may be familiar with Dr. Nedley's program, Depression Anxiety Program. That one is residential. So some people who need more intensive treatment and want a lived-in experience, it's a 10-day residential program. This one's a little bit closer. The next one, Relationship Therapy Center, is closer to where I'm at, but because all of you are within California, you could do virtual appointments. So a lot of people, when they're looking specifically for marital counseling or family counseling, the Relationship Therapy Center is a good resource. And then Psychology Today is you can plug in your location or a family member's location, and it'll bring up a directory of local therapists. And then word of mouth, asking people, prayer is important. And then there's an online coaching, especially those of you that are looking for faith-based coaching. It's called Abide Network Counseling. You can just Google it, it'll come up, and there's a whole network of individuals who provide online coaching, especially if you're outside of California, or it's an avenue to receive those kinds of resources. And then, as I mentioned, if you'd like the slides, you can email me at kcruz@beautifulmindsmedical and just say Hopland slides. That's all I need, and I will send you a digital copy of these slides. And so if you haven't taken any pictures, this is the one to take, because you can't have my email without, you can't have the slides without my email. So if you do want the slides, and then if you have a question, and you can email me, just an FYI, because this is probably the most common question I get of, can I see you as my therapist? In general, the answer has been no, because I have a 2-year wait list. But then I got pregnant, and the answer is further no, because I'll be going on maternity leave, and then primarily going to be a stay-at-home mother with only doing a few hours. So I'm not taking on any clients. I'm sorry. I know people bond with me as I'm here, but I have wonderful colleagues. And I don't just say that. I really, Beautiful Minds is a special place. So you can reach out to Beautiful Minds. You'll know that in general there are wait lists. It's a sad reality of therapy and accessing therapy, but pray, and God will always open doors necessary for you to receive your healing. I've known people who are like, I've been trying and this and that, and then God opens a door in a way that when you seek it, God will collaborate with you to give you the resources that you need. But if you're like, hey, Katie, I have this specific problem, do you have a book that you recommend? Just email me. Just know that in March, I'm not going to be accessing any more emails. So you got to get in before March if you want to ask me any questions, but feel free to jot down my email address. But before she comes up to give, I would like to say a special prayer for everyone. So if you can bow your heads with me as we pray. Father in heaven, I'm always just so grateful for the opportunity to share. And you know that my heart explodes with the desire to share more and to hear more of these individual stories. But I know that you know, and that you care deeply in a way that you already are in the process of healing each person here. We carry, all of us, brokenness in our hearts, and we know that you desire, like that hemorrhaging woman, for us to be whole. And so, Father, whatever they need, whether it's therapy, whether it's reviewing these slides or books, whatever, we pray that you and your Spirit can direct them, but most importantly, that they can be directed to you as this wonderful counselor and a wonderful healer. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.